Hello. I've been asked to give a talk at a conference next week on the psychology of leadership, and I thought it would be helpful for me and possibly beneficial for anybody who is interested in this topic if, as part of my practice run through, I recorded it and stuck it up on YouTube. So this will be a bit rough because I haven't practiced it before, but I hope that there's something in the concepts here that might be of some value. So the name of the talk is The Psychology of Leadership, and then more specifically, how engaging with psychological needs can increase performance, creativity, and happiness at work. So here we go. A first little question to stimulate a bit of thought. What do people need to flourish at work? When you've been at your happiest, most engaged, most fulfilled at work, what are the factors which have led to that? Have you ever experienced a deep sense of well-being when you've been working? What led to you experiencing that well-being? There are multiple theories of this and many different authors who've examined the positive psychology, motivation, understanding people's needs. One of the models which stood out for me and over the years I think has stood the test of time quite well is David Rock's concept of the SCARF model. So he talks about 5 specific needs: our need for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. People need to feel valued. They need to feel that they have some control over where they are now and into the future. People need to feel that they belong, and there's a very good reason for that, and that when we look at how we've evolved as people, that if we weren't accepted by our tribe or by our group, then our likelihood of survival would have been significantly reduced. And we also need to feel fairly treated, but also that our colleagues and loved ones are treated fairly as well. So we have these fundamental underlying needs, and a significant amount of conflict, unhappiness, even negative well-being experiences come from our fundamental needs not being met in some way. So if you've ever worked for perhaps an inexperienced manager who's given you very critical feedback in a directive way, or you've had a great idea and you've voiced it to a boss or in a meeting, the idea is being shut down, or you've been told that you can't do it, it's very dispiriting, it's disheartening, very difficult that people are like, well, it's going to be very difficult and very unlikely for people to give their best when these needs, that the need to feel valued, to feel safe, to feel in control, aren't met. So putting a leadership angle on this, it's really worth thinking about when we're communicating with people. Are we understanding and engaging with these underlying needs? When we are overly directive, prescriptive, when we tell people what we want them to do and also how to do it, we're undermining these fundamental needs. And that's really worth thinking about in terms of how we're communicating with people. Another thing to be aware of, I think, in terms of understanding people's needs is the power of belief. And the person on this slide is Albert Bandura, who was an incredibly influential social psychologist in the second half of the 20th century. In fact, he died only a couple of years ago, 2021, I think, at a great age. So he obviously was getting something right. Anybody who lives to be nearly 100, it clearly has something to share with the world. but Bandura, hugely influential for a number of different topics, but the one that I'm focusing on today is self-efficacy, which is the conviction that you can successfully execute the behavior required to produce a desired outcome. Self-efficacy is the belief that you can do something and achieve a result. It's a little bit different to self-confidence, which is a more general state. Self-efficacy tends to be specific to individual behaviors or skills. So, for example, self-efficacy in maths is that you can do maths well to achieve good grades in a maths exam. self-efficacy in statistics, which is something which has been studied quite a bit, is just the belief that you can engage with statistics, that you can learn it, solve problems with statistics, and and again pass your university course or whatever it is, where whatever the context is that you're learning or engaging with statistics. So it's fundamentally it's the belief that you can do something quite specific. And what's so interesting about this is just how closely connected belief is to results. So self-efficacy has been studied and measured, and there are multiple tools and instruments which have been developed to do this. But essentially, where someone's belief that they can do something is high, they're more likely to take on greater levels of challenge. So that it's likely that they'll be more ambitious in terms of the challenges that they'll take on. It's more likely that they'll persevere. So they tend to be more resilient around that specific behavior. So if there are setbacks, they'll be more likely to keep on going if belief is high that they will ultimately get there. And of course, because of all of that, they are more likely to perform better. So belief and outcomes really do seem to be closely connected. And again, this is an interesting thing for leaders to think about in terms of getting the best out of people, that if we're encouraging people to be confident, to have high levels of belief around their job role or specific challenges that we've set them, the likelihood that they'll achieve successful outcomes is significantly higher. There's been multiple studies on this, and meta studies which really show that there is a strong relationship between self-efficacy and positive outcomes. So traditional leadership models, and I suppose I think with this about perhaps more ideas around, say, perhaps transformational leadership, which is really the kind of the model of the charismatic leader. They have their place, but there are also challenges, I suppose, with these traditional, more hierarchical perspectives on leadership. So a lot of these theories have emerged from the 20th century, where organizations often tended to fit a fairly hierarchical model, a steep power gradient. And as part of these models, it was quite normal for power to be held by an individual or a small number of individuals in the organization. So it was often the case that the leadership model is that people would look to an individual, possibly a charismatic, capable, an inspiring individual to be the leader in the group. And so really a lot of these traditional theories of leadership or models of leadership are really theories of the leader rather than leadership, which is a more complex concept that's much more about the interrelationships between people rather than the concept of this heroic or inspiring individual. And I suppose a alternative to that, and the model of leadership that I'm advocating for today, is known as generative leadership. Just let the train go. I'm going to keep on going. I'm not going to stop now. So so generative leadership is just a different way of thinking about leadership. It's ultimately around creativity. So the problem with the traditional perspectives on leadership is that they are generally dependent on, if you like, the perspective, the decision making, and the thinking of this one individual who sits at the top of the hierarchy of the organization. That's not a great model for creativity. We're missing a trick there, because actually one person can only see so much. And as we move through the 21st century, one thing that seems to be the case is that the challenges facing organizations are becoming increasingly complex. So if we think about the need for logistics organizations to reach net zero, to find ways of working in a sustainable way. If you think about, for any organization, the challenges around being truly inclusive, of the challenges that equity pose in terms of managing an organization, but also ensuring that individuals' needs and interests are acknowledged and engaged with. These are not straightforward things. post-COVID, the challenge, even by people perhaps who might be kind of a bit less at the top of the organization, but who need to manage people who are remote and in the office, and again doing that with fairness and ensuring that that everybody has certainty and autonomy. It's extremely difficult, and so the world of work, the trends that we're seeing in the world of work, arguably, are becoming more complex, and so that's why new ways of thinking are necessary. So old solutions, yesterday's thinking, will not necessarily work for tomorrow's challenges. There's been quite a lot of work in recent years. One person who's been quite well published on this is Matthew Syed, with his quite popular book, Rebel Ideas, which certainly had some interesting ideas. Is that one way through this is to move away from the dependence on the brilliant individual, or the kind of the maybe not so brilliant individual in some cases, but ultimately the, if you like, the powerful person at the top of the organization, to a much more shared model of leadership. And here, where creativity comes from isn't from really one person's perspective, but it's from multiple perspectives. It's different psychologies, and even cross-generational thinking. And again, where we've seen experimentation with reverse mentoring and that sort of thing, where we try to sort of look at how actually different generations who have been brought up in different social times and will have different experiences of interaction, use of technology, different levels of, say, political awareness and that sort of thing. It's how we tap into these differences. That's where creativity, genuine original thinking and creativity is more likely to come from. So how do we unlock that? A similar idea is distributed leadership, and that's the idea of, again, rather than power being held by an individual in the group, it's shared amongst the group. And that presents its challenges, because actually if decision making and power is shared, then so also the responsibility for the results, if you like, the accountability, needs to be shared in the group as well. So it's not necessarily a straightforward thing to achieve, but it's certainly an interesting idea if we want greater levels of diversity, multiple perspectives, people who think differently and can bring novel ideas. We need to think differently about leadership as well. Thinking about how we work with individuals, ask rather than tell, and also coming back to what people need to flourish. When someone brings you a challenge or a problem, what do we tend to do? Do we tend to give them a direction? This is what you need to do this to solve the issue. Do we tend to tell people what to do, or do we ask them questions instead? When we're told, when we're given direction, what that tends to do is it sort of diminishes us a little bit. And so if you've ever been in that position where you've wanted to explore an idea and you've just been or you've maybe had the kind of the kernel of an idea, and you've gone and spoken to a boss about it, and they've just come back to you with advice. This is what you need to do. How's that made you feel? Has that generated your best thinking? It's unlikely that it's the case that it has. And so one thing to think about in terms of how we engage with individuals, if we want to kind of create this more generative environment, it's how do we replace advice and direction with questions, thinking questions? When someone brings you a challenge, how about, asking them something like, what have you tried so far? Or tell me what you're thinking about that issue, or what would you propose? And again, rather than, if you like, taking the challenge away from them, we create a thinking environment with that individual. It takes a bit longer, and it requires a degree of patience. It's difficult to do if you've been running around with your hair on fire and there's a lot of stress in how you're working. So this method of leadership isn't without its challenges. But it's so interesting if we can get that right. If we can create the environment to replace instruction, advice, and direction with curiosity and questions, then we are starting to move into this much more generative way of working. Lots of benefits to this, again, in terms of the creativity of the solution, but also the engagement of the individual. But also, when we don't rescue people and we encourage them to think, problem solve, and make decisions for themselves, we are also developing their thinking capability. So all sorts of advantages for for the engagement of that person, but also possibly succession planning in the organization. We're developing people who are thinkers, not just doers. Moving then into more of a team environment, this is, I suppose, where the magic really happens. And Aristotle's famous quote, well, attributed to Aristotle, I've got no idea if it was really him. I doubt anybody really knows. But anyway, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That actually, when you get the right group of people working in the right way, that's where creativity is more likely to come from, through the sort of essentially a kind of the development of one another's ideas, to the exploration of ideas which might not necessarily seem sensible in the first instance, but which under the right conditions we can develop. How do we get to this? Again, the magic of teams. So the image there is a great little New York Times article, which is freely available if you Google it. Well, so Google it. It's about Google. What Google learned from its quest to build the perfect team, and they called it Project Aristotle. Ultimately, a big study of about 180 different teams in the business. What were the things that made the most creative teams? What made those teams different to the teams which were perhaps a little bit more change averse, perhaps a little bit more routine? The number one thing, psychological safety. So what is that? It's become a popular concept, and Amy Edmondson, who's well published on this and has been really over the last 20 years, says that it's the belief that we can take interpersonal risks within a team. So I suppose the questions which kind of relate to this, it's that, are we safe to learn? Can we make mistakes in the team environment? If we do make mistakes, what happens next? Do we get all hellfire and brimstone poured down upon us? Is everybody able to contribute to the plans that teams develops, or the work that we're working towards? And perhaps at its best, can we challenge one another's ideas without fear that people are going to hold grudges? If someone says something that you maybe take issue with, or that you want to kind of interrogate a little bit, are you able to call that out in the meeting, or do you tend to not do that? Do you hold back and either not address it or speak to them one-to-one in a corridor a little bit later? In which case, that would, I suppose, raise a question about how have we got the optimal team environment? A lovely little concept to put a bit more structure around that is Timothy Clark's 4 stages of psychological safety. And so his 2 axes are respect and permission. To what extent do we value one another's contributions? To what extent do we trust, delegate, and let people go? Where there's the absence of either, that's exclusion. So the absence of psychological safety, and that tends to be where people either aren't invited to meetings, information isn't shared, and it's likely that if you do get people together, everybody stays quiet. So silent teams, essentially. Not really a team there, it's more perhaps a group of individuals, co-located individuals or whatever. Where psychological starts is inclusion. So psychological safety starts, it's inclusion. So this is where everybody is welcome, they're made to feel like they belong. So people are invited, they're copied into information, and they're made to feel like they're part of a team. Where things start to get exciting, though, is learning safety. So this is where we are encouraged to take risks. You can put forward half-formed thoughts. Making mistakes is okay, but particularly where it's sort of perhaps in the discursive area where it's not necessarily life and death, we can test out ideas without fear. You can possibly, even if the idea is a bit daft, you would feel comfortable about verbalizing it, to sort of, because it's sometimes those daft ideas that really do kind of take flight. Apparently, when the first person sort of mooted the idea of merging wheels with suitcases, everybody thought it was hilarious. But of course, as you know, it's now very hard to find a suitcase without a wheel on it. Contribution safety, that's possibly something to work towards. This is perhaps, requires a little bit of maturity in the team to get to, but this is where whatever the work the team does, whatever the strategy or the plan that you develop, everybody in the team is able to contribute to that. So that's, I suppose, moving into this distributed leadership idea, where everybody has a stake, where decision making is shared in the team, and our highest level of psychological safety there, challenge safety. It's where we can challenge one another's ideas without fear. I've heard people say, "Oh, I did challenge today, and I fear that it was the career-limiting conversation." That's what we're trying to avoid with this. It's that actually you can even challenge the boss when they put forward an idea that you might take issue with. But the key thing to this, I think, to make it work, is that it's about challenging the idea, not the person. So it's intellectual challenge, it's not social challenge. So I think that's probably an important component of it. So to get to it. The two boxes in red are traps that we can fall into where we have one without the other. So lots of respect, but very little delegation, trust and permission, paternalism. That's, I suppose, if you like, very traditional organizations where there's a very steep power gradient, possibly high levels of micromanagement. We do respect each other, but actually, you live in an environment where your work might be rigorously checked or your decision making is very limited. The other side to exploitation. So this is where you might carry an awful lot of responsibility. You might be, you might have an awful lot of work that's delegated to you, but you're not made to feel valued for doing all of that work or for that contribution. This is the sort of thing where, you have people perhaps in the team who do more than others are aware, and they work really hard and they do carry heavy weight. And then when they leave because they don't feel valued, you find that you have to hire 2 or 3 people in order to replace them. There we go. So the stages of psychological safety. Some little questions to think about. If you think about a team that you're part of at the moment, and it may be several teams, so just choose one. When you think about that team, what's the stage of psychological safety that you would say that team most normally works at? And it may fluctuate, it may vary a little bit depending on factors, but is there a particular level of psychological safety that you would say that team is working at the moment? Be interesting to think about wherever it is, what contributes to that, either positive or negative. What are the factors that kind of puts that team climate essentially where it is? And here's the leadership question: what can you do? What's the action that could be within your control that might grow, develop, or increase psychological safety to take it one step up the ladder? Is there anything that you could actually? One thing I think is quite nice, again, just as a little touch that I've observed, it's when you deliberately bring other people into the discussion. So it's when you make time, make space for people perhaps who've been a little bit quiet, who haven't been necessarily fully engaged, who seem deep in thought, and particularly if they're newer to the team, it's creating opportunity and space to bring other people into the discussion. That's just one little idea. Last thoughts. Psychological safety there, as it positioned it's linear, and I've had numerous discussions with people about it, and one of the themes of discussion that I've thought about is that it's not the same for everybody. For some people just seem to come into the room and they own the room, and because of how they present and the confidence that they have, the self-belief that they come into the room with, they just seem to have that sort of, they seem to have the permission of that high level of psychological safety right from the get-go. Other people have to work much harder for it, and it could be because of how they're perceived. It could be because of factors like neurodivergence and that sort of thing, which, and again, if the way that we work, or if you like, the team climate doesn't necessarily account for individual preferences or needs, then it can be a much harder ladder to climb. So I suppose, again, thinking a little bit about equity, it's psychological safety requires us to think with a little bit more nuance about the needs of individuals rather than just treating everybody the same. So I suppose that's my last thought on it. I'll be interested to see how long this has taken. I think my lecture spot is about 45 minutes. So doing it on this format will always be a bit quicker. I hope there's been a few ideas which are useful there to anybody who's watched this. And my email address was there on the front. If anybody would like to discuss anything here, please drop me a note. I'd love to know your thoughts. Thank you very much for listening to my little talk.